The following is a presentation from the 9th Annual Humanities Days at Montgomery College. The Human in Humanities, Understanding Ourselves and Others. This year we offered 30 remote events via Zoom. To learn more about Humanities Days at Montgomery College and to access other program recordings, please go to this website.
Welcome to the 9th Annual Humanities Days at Montgomery College. My name is Amanda Miller, Professor of Art and Coordinator of the Artist in Residence program in Germantown and Rockville. Thank you to everyone for coming, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event, Our Patterns, Artist Talk with Artist in Residence, Natan Diacon-Furtado. This talk is also part of the Artist in Residence program in the Rockville and Germantown art departments, which is sponsored by the Arts Institute. Our 3-week artist residency takes place each fall and spring semester and offers students the opportunity to work directly with a professional artist who leads them in a collaborative project. This semester's residency has taken place virtually. Natan Diacon-Furtado's 3-week AIR project, Our Patterns, Montgomery College, unites students from 6 2D design studio classes to create a virtual community quilt of patterns, a project that fosters discovery and understanding of each student's patterns of exploration, working, creativity, family tradition, and more. Many thanks to art faculty who committed 3 weeks of their classes to this project and this wonderful experience, Professors Judy Stone, Naomi Chung, Jenny Carolyn, and Robin Meyer. Please join me in welcoming Natan Diacon-Furtado.
Hey, everybody.
So we've been so fortunate to be able to work with Natan over these past 3 weeks, and he has prepared a video presentation for us to watch together, and then we'll have an opportunity for conversation and questions and answers afterwards.
Hi, my name is Natan Diacon-Furtado, and I'm this semester's visiting virtual artist at Montgomery College. And in my art and design work, I work with a globally Southern heritage of pattern making as a language, art, and craft to create interactive and collaborative pieces that put me into community with my collaborators. As a child, I had the privilege of growing up between East Tennessee and the country of Brazil, both places deeply involved in the concept of pattern making and using simple geometries to tell great stories and also bring communities together and create identities for those communities. And I think I was deeply influenced by all of that and that practice of being able to create a community and create a space for community out of the simplest of materials. And that influence caused me to try to learn how to practice architecture and also become a cultural anthropologist. And as an architect, I became really fascinated with how working with families and working with folks on their houses, we could actually begin to design spaces that allowed them to do things they never thought possible or live life in a way they had never imagined before. And then as a cultural anthropologist, I was always fascinated in the idea of where creativity came from and trying to explore where, before we're conscious about it, where this subconscious impulse to be creative comes from. And so both of those influences really go directly into the art and the design work that I make now. As an artist, I focus a lot on work that can visually code switch, that is, can contain multiple meanings and multiple communities within it. And sometimes that work looks like sculpture, which with the flick of a switch and the change in lighting can either reveal or conceal its identity through pattern. And also sometimes it looks like work which embeds my memory and emotions into a sculpture through pattern making, but then allows for the creation of new memories and new motions and emotions by visitors by letting them interact with those pieces and create their own assemblages of those pieces. Today, I'm going to talk specifically about a series of projects that I've created called Our Patterns that are collaborative pattern-making projects that span multiple weeks and put me into intentional communities with students across the United States in creating collaborative pattern-making projects. The first of these projects, Our Patterns Muncie, was created during the height of the coronavirus pandemic and involved me working virtually and remotely with students at Ball State University to create an intentional pattern-making community on Instagram. Each of us for 3 weeks would go online and create patterns that talked about how we were feeling, where we were, what we were hoping the next days would be like, and we used our patterns to convey that to each other and to begin to speak a visual language back and forth. And after 3 weeks, we realized we had created a beautiful digital quilt of patterns that could be scrolled much like you could look up and down on a real physical quilt. But by being digital, we realized we were open to amazing new possibilities for how these patterns could actually interact with the outside world, outside of our own communities. And a big part of that was thinking about how these patterns could be projected back into the physical communities in which they were created. And so for Our Patterns Muncie, at the end of the 3 weeks of creating our digital patterns, we began to project those patterns around town, around downtown Muncie and Ball State University's campus. And doing so allowed what was a virtual community to become a physical community and have the energy of that pattern-making workshop become real in space, and to draw people who hadn't even been a part of that workshop into the community and begin to experience some of that joy and some of that pattern language and begin to talk between each other. Tapping into my training as a cultural anthropologist and my interests in where creativity comes from, all of the Our Patterns projects start with the creation of a stamp as a tool for self-exploration by each collaborator. I like to think of these stamps as tools for exploring each of our subconscious and for also exploring each of our creative points of view. For the first week of each project, students and collaborators create these stamps as ways of noticing what's around them, noticing how they're feeling, noticing all the patterns in their life, emotional, physical, even visual, and trying to use those to create simple geometries that allow us to explore deeper within each of ourselves. We take those stamps and we start to play with them and create patterns. And there's no rhyme or reason necessary to how the stamps are used to create patterns, but what I found is just the simple act of physically taking this stamp, this tool that each collaborator has made specifically for themselves, and then being able to engage with this tool that was created specifically for you and use that tool to make patterns. Just that act allows each participant to really tap into a deep reservoir of creativity. And it's a reservoir of creativity that's very specific to each person. So we see a lot of disparate patterns start to get created, and we see a lot of pattern making that starts to speak the same language but be very self-specific. As an anthropologist, I've always been fascinated with this idea that instead of thinking about something as site-specific, something as field work that has to be in a specific place, I like to think of what I'm doing here as creating these tools so that we can conduct a field work that's self-specific, where each of these collaborators can actually conduct sort of an exploration of themselves through this pattern making. And then through all this fun, through all this creation of patterns, we eventually come to a final pattern for each collaborator, a pattern that takes these tools and all of the knowledge and the fun that they've had and the explorations of each of themselves and creates a pattern that is self-specific and about them in the world. And what I found, which is fascinating, is that at the end of the 3 weeks, these patterns are all an amazing, diverse array of images, but they all start to speak to each other through a beautiful pattern visual language. At Montgomery College, we're about 3/4 of the way through this project. And so I'm really excited to show you a couple images from students who are participating in this right now. So here you can see we're starting at the top left with stamp making as a way of thinking about our point of view, thinking about our past, thinking about who we are, and then taking that stamp and starting to play with pattern making, realizing the forms that we didn't even know were there coming to the surface, and then using that knowledge that we find out about ourselves, what we actually see in patterns, using that to create a final image. And it's really a thing of beauty. And as you can see here, there's no wrong or right way to do this, and that leads to an amazing diversity of visuals and languages. And that's a diversity that we want to put on display at the end of each of these projects. And so for our Patterns Montgomery, we're working to create a beautiful display, whether it be projected like in this rendering or physical, in which each of the patterns that the students made can be brought into community with each other. And that energy that's created by bringing those patterns into community can be brought then out into the wider world and the wider community of Montgomery College. Recently, I had the pleasure of conducting some different experimental art patterns projects at Indiana University with their School of Art and Design. And I wanted to share those projects with you here too and talk about the things I'm excited about learning from them as variations on the template that I created with Art Patterns Muncie and with Art Patterns Montgomery College. For Art Patterns Bloomington, I tried to condense the pattern making exercise from 3 weeks to 1 day. And I worked with a group of about 14 students in the School of Art and Design to work with letterpress materials, scraps, to create patterns that talked about our innermost secrets that we weren't willing to tell anybody else. And so as a group, over the course of about 4 hours, we worked with these scraps and began to figure out how one can make meaning with scraps that are sort of meaningless to us. And I think that the resulting quilt was really beautiful in the way that it continued to speak a pattern language between each student and between the different secrets in the quilt, but didn't fully reveal itself. And so it was an exercise in being able to communicate something to yourself as the person making the pattern, but also being able to control the way in which that pattern could be legible to the outside world. While at Indiana University, I also collaborated with the Wiley House Museum and their historical archive to attempt an Art Patterns project that actually collaborated with historical figures through the information left behind by them and about them. And that project became Art Patterns, the Orator, the Astronomer, and the Poet. And one of those individuals that I got to collaborate with was Elizabeth Breckenridge. Elizabeth Breckenridge was the live-in servant for the Wiley family at what became the Wiley House Museum from the age of 13 until she passed away in her late 40s and early 50s. And this project was really interested in taking the little scraps of information we had about Elizabeth and collaborating with them to create patterns that brought her presence back into the house and allowed visitors to the museum to experience her as a full being. Getting the opportunity to collaborate with Elizabeth and 2 other folks from the Wiley House Museum's archives was really exciting to me because it felt like a return to cultural anthropology, and it felt like I'm almost starting to make a full circle loop between using these pattern making workshops as a creative project and being able to tap into pattern making as a research tool and a way of discovering communities and ourselves even further. And so that's where I'm at. I'm really excited about just in this small period of time how I've been able to develop this project in community and with folks like the students that I've been blessed to work with at Montgomery College. I'm really interested in this idea that an art project can also be a tool for community research and for social research. I'm really interested in the way in which maybe that allows research that in some ways from anthropology we think of as intrusive or not coming from the community itself. I'm really interested in the way in which these art projects can actually flip that script and have the research come from ourselves, from within communities. And in that way, I'm really interested again in how it ties all back into this idea of visual code switching that my art starts from. This idea that we can be in control of how our identities are revealed and consumed. And that through pattern making, we can start to actually speak our own languages about that and be able to control our own narratives about that. And so for the Art Patterns projects, I'm just really excited to see how all of that can be conglomerated into this kind of amazing collaborative project that can continue to grow into the future. And so I'm just really thankful for you all being here today. And I'm really excited to get to answer any questions and just have a conversation with you all about whatever interests you in my work and in my projects. And again, thank you for coming. Bye.
So thank you so much for that presentation about your work, Natan. I'd like to encourage that audience members and participants, if you have questions, please go ahead and share your questions in the chat, and we can read them out loud for Natan to discuss. And yeah, like just to start things off, I wanted to ask a little bit about this idea of place in your work. You talked about your experience of growing up in two places in Tennessee and Brasilia, as well as the way you've worked with different communities and different locations, both physically and virtually, like you're doing with us. And then even currently, I think you're splitting your time between two cities. So how does that influence your art practice?
That's a great question. Thank you. I first off, I think because I grew up, like you're talking about, in between the southern United States and Brazil, and then really spent my whole life until I was 18 going back and forth, 1 year here, 1 year there, and then I still live sort of between New Orleans and New York. And I think for me, because of all that translation and movement, place ends up really being inside of each of us instead of an actual physical place, is really how I've started to think about it. And I think that's a lot about the code switching is like that too, right? It's about establishing a place that's sort of natural for us, that's inside of ourselves, that we can kind of carry back and forth. And so, I really have, what's been beautiful about the Art Patterns project is it's really allowed me to sort of expand this idea that I've had in myself since growing up as a kid, in between going back and forth, that we can sort of start to build a place that's inside each of ourselves. And that can be like a really true place to come from when you create art. And it can also really start to explore ourselves in a way we're not maybe used to on a daily basis. And that's all about just, switching the idea of place from a physical location to being a location that we each sort of carry around inside of us.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sort of following on that idea a little bit, you've talked about your work and the work that you guide your students through as intuitive and involving self-discovery, and even, sometimes having an unconscious connections that you realize later. How does that process work?
It's hard to describe, right? I think the key of the process is just trusting yourself, right? And so the that's the most important aspect. And I think it's not something that we generally experience in an art making practice or in a school practice, is the idea that the most trustful and trustworthy information about yourself comes from yourself, and that you can actually explore that as like an academic or a creative pursuit, or both together. And so that's really where it starts from. And again, that's about locating a place as being something that's real inside of you. And so in order to really tap into that location and to be able to translate, what you find, we need to really start a practice of trusting ourselves. And that comes from, making art and not worrying too much about it. That's kind of the intuitive aspect, is just playing and seeing what happens. And then the secondary part of that intuitive aspect is actually, how do I say this? Actually, I'm losing the word for this. I'm going to just say a random word. Actually, it's sort of like taking charge of what comes up, right? So for example, something I really love guiding the students through and that I love doing myself is I'll play and just intuitively put pieces together when I'm stamp making. And then when an accident happens or something that I wasn't expecting happens, the most important part is to lay claim to that, right? And say, no, I actually did that on purpose. I just didn't know. And then by doing that, you bring all this power from within yourself into the work. And then I think that lets you just really start exploring deeper and deeper into your own subconscious.
Do you, that's really interesting. Do you edit the work that you do, or it sounds like you really put something down and then you allow that to take you further? But are there times when you say, oh no, that doesn't feel right? Or
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, that's a part of it, right? Because as you sort of work, the beautiful part about working intuitively and just letting yourself sort of be guided is you hit these sort of milestones where you're like, oh, now I think I know what this is about. And then you can go back with this new lens. Like the beautiful part about this in anthropology, right? We talk about viewing cultures through your own lens or viewing things through others' lenses. And it's like the beautiful part about working intuitively like this is you get to build a series of your own lenses with which you can look back at the thing you just did, right? And so it's almost like a perspective shift, right? When you get this idea, you're like, oh no, this is actually about this. Oh, now when I go back, I see this piece in a whole new way, I can edit it. So yeah, it's definitely about, I mean, I think at the base level, it's a weird metaphor to say, but I think all of this work is about translating, right? And so like being able to go back and edit is a way of sort of translating the ideas and bringing them out more.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that that
you.
perspective. Yeah, and I'm thinking about like the different just the different threads of creativity that run through your work and the different perspectives that you bring to it. You know, you're an artist, a designer, an architect, an anthropologist, and it's really fascinating how your work touches upon all of those things. Do you find that like creativity plays a role in each discipline, or how did you arrive at these different connections?
That's a great question. I think I have to give credit where credit is due and say that, mention that my mom is an installation artist, and my dad's a historian who writes these really beautiful sort of creative nonfiction historical books. And so I think from an early age, I was used to the idea that of seeing that like, oh, you can practice creatively in an art profession and you can practice creatively in a not art or an academic profession, right? And so I was used to those worlds sort of being merged. And then as a kid, I was my mom's studio assistant. So I was used to like the daily process of making an art piece and like seeing it through to the end and making these big installations and knowing that if I start small, I get there. And so knowing that you just sort of carry the way you work through, and then the next installation has nothing to do with the first installation, but somehow the things you learned are transmissible, right? They kind of like can get you through. And so for me, I think it's I don't ever think about the fact that like, oh yeah, I've practiced in all these different realms until somebody mentions it. And then it's like, oh yeah, because I just sort of, it's the same way as working intuitively. I've just sort of been, blessed and privileged to be able to sort of stumble along this career and then have creativity as a central focus of it along the way, each way. And so, starting out, going to college and becoming an anthropologist, and then going deeper into realizing, oh, anthropology for me isn't necessarily about the study of people or specific cultures. It's about the study of where creativity comes from. And then letting that sort of push me into an area that it's started to become like, oh, maybe it's not anthropology anymore, right? Maybe it's architecture. And then it was like, okay, and then I can follow that path. And then I sort of worked as an architect until I started having these ideas and doing these projects that started pushing me like, oh, these aren't buildings anymore, they're installations. And so it's been about this sort of like kind of not thoughtful in any way, just intuitive stumbling through the careers. And then now is when everything's starting, as I mentioned in the video, starting to kind of like come back full circle. And we're starting to be able to see how these installations and these art projects can be these research tools and how they can make physical space. And so it really feels like a homecoming that in my own self, right, in my creative practice.
Thank you. And I see there's a question. Let me see if I can help to unmute from Fred. Bear with me one moment.
No problem.
Here we go. Fred, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I'm interested in art, and I'm not an artist, but I do some painting. I'm not familiar with how to make these patterns and what tools do they use to put these pattern together in a large scale as you have presented in your patterns that you have. And is that kind of digital things and devices, or things that after you created a pattern, a small scale, and then you put them together? That's my...
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that question. That's a beautiful question. Yeah, so there's a big factor of being able, I think, to work intuitively and to work in a big collaborative group like we've done for this project and still be able to work intuitively is like making sure that there's no sort of barriers in skill level, right? And making sure that the tools aren't a barrier either. So we've actually done a lot of work with the professors of Montgomery College and Amanda and myself to make sure that, to kind of answer exactly your question, like how many different tools can we use to get to the same spot? And the answer is I personally don't use any digital manipulation I tend to use just rubber stamp making materials, and I cut custom rubber stamps, and then I I layer them up slowly, and it's, it takes a long time over large pieces of paper or sculpture. Students are totally encouraged to use digital means as well, and a lot of them do, but the basic material is a rubber stamp, carving it with an X-Acto knife, or a rubber stamp carving nib. But there's also a ton of other options, right? So a lot of students also did stencil work, where they would cut the shape out of a piece of paper and then, paint over that and move the stencil around. Also, you can use a stamp making, you can make cardboard into a stamp making material, right? So you can carve into thicker cardboard. And then we had students that stamped with that. We had students that beautifully used potatoes, sponges. I think something I like to encourage in this process is sometimes the tool that you reach for, the tool that's available to you, has something to do with the story you're trying to tell, right? And you might not know it yet. And so I like to emphasize that, like, if you're working and something calls out to you and it doesn't seem like a traditional stamp making tool, it's worth exploring using that as a tool too, because that might connect to some part of, what's going on inside of you that you're not fully tapped into yet. And so, yeah, the process is meant to be open. I think the beauty of technology, and something that I try to use for the projections and stuff like that, is technology allows us to work small but be big, And so yeah, I really encourage students to not get too scared about being big, and so focus on something that's like 6 inches by 6 inches or 12 inches by 12 inches, and just know and trust that we can blow this up to be, at a monumental scale. And I think there's something really cool about students and collaborators experiencing that shift, right? With the projects we've done before, where we've projected onto buildings afterwards, nobody's quite ready for the emotional impact that it has on them to see this thing that they worked on that was tabletop size being building size. And that's a really cool shift that technology allows us to do.
Okay, thank you for that. And we have a question from Daniela. Does your work with exploration as an adventure help students to succeed in their artwork?
I hope so. I hope so. Honestly, I don't so much care about that as much as I just like it to make them slightly happier with whatever they're doing at that moment. I think that's the baseline. I think if I'm really lucky, it helps folks succeed and continue to be a little freer and more open to putting themselves more into their work. But I'm honestly less interested in whether their art is successful, and more interested in whether this tool brings us together and makes us feel this sense of connection, and that leaves us as better people, by a little tiny minuscule increment.
Yeah, you've talked about this idea of, just to follow up on that response. That's really interesting. So you've talked about how that, like, as an artist, you can sort of have this process of self-discovery, but then when you're working together, like, how does that community piece happen? That not only are the students making their own work, but they're also, building something larger as a community quilt and having that experience.
Yeah, I think that it happens organically and kind of without, the beauty is it happens organically and without folks really having to think about it. I think that there's something really beautiful about intentionally coming into a space with a group of people and saying, I'm going to be open and I'm going to make this thing that's about me. And what happens from that process is that all of a sudden you start seeing all these other collaborators making pieces that are about them. And then because it's all a patterned visual language, we can start to compare, right? We can be like, oh, that reminds me of this thing I did, or that is totally cool, but I would have never spoken it that way or spoken this language that way. And so it starts to create these connections, both with similarities and with differences. And that really starts to create this community environment. It's not, a forever community. It's just an intentional, temporary community that I think is created by each of us coming to the work in an open-hearted way.
Excellent, thank you. And I see Professor Sprain has a question. Let me think.
Okay, I think I can talk now, right? Hi, I'm Maria Sprain. I teach anthropology here at Montgomery College.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so it's great to meet another anthropologist. So this work is really, really wonderful. I wasn't sure what to expect, but my initial reaction is that it really stretches the definition of art. And that's really exciting, right? Like, it's just, culture's dynamic, it changes. And here you have this project that is individualistic, but then brings the community together. And then when it's projected on the buildings, that is so amazing. I love it. it's temporary, right? It's like street art, but it's street art that can be, and I mean that in a loving way. I love street art. It's street art that can be, shared by so many other viewers, right? So you're taking all these individuals and then you're projecting it, and then you have passersby or whoever's around can see that. So I was wondering, can you get people to do this who are not in the same art studio? Like, can you collaborate across national boundaries, right? Can you link this to maybe to immigrants connecting across boundaries? I don't know, maybe that's like a project for the future, but if you could say something about, this idea of place being also stretched and then creating community and belonging.
Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful question. And it's part of what I'm trying to figure out, right? I think in a lot of ways, the project started out as being about collaboration in a studio setting or an academic setting, because that's the easiest pitch, right? That's the easiest way to start creating the work and get people comfortable with the ideas. Because if I just come out and say, like, we're thinking about doing this intuitive collaborative project, it's going to span the globe, I think it's like a little harder to convince folks to do it, but I think we're getting there, right? And I think that was the beautiful part about one of the projects I showed that I did at Indiana University, which was this project, but it was with collaborators that were just in the archives. They were collaborators that had passed away in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so it was this idea that you could start stretching the idea of collaboration that way. And I'd love to be able to stretch the idea of collaboration across, continents and boundaries, exactly like you're talking about. And that's a big part of why I love the projection element too, is because it's not physical, right? And so we've had a really neat experience, which was we did this work at Ball State for Art Patterns Muncie, and then that work touched some folks that were in a totally different part of Indiana, and they were able to actually get the projections put up there. So the projections that were created in Muncie, they moved to the town of Gary. And then they were displayed again, and then they're in a new context, right? So all of a sudden, these patterns that are about one place and about exploring that place and creating a community in that place are all of a sudden in a totally new place. And now they're doing something totally different, right? They're kind of like connecting with people based on a different location. And we're starting to connect these geographies through this projection that's happening temporarily. And so I think there's something really cool to keep exploring there. I'm really excited about this project because of this, right? Because there's just so many avenues it can keep growing in. But yeah, to answer your question, that's exactly what I'm excited to do.
Thanks for that question, Maria. Do you think, Natan, that you will continue to do work virtually even when it's easier to work in person? Like, is that something that you would continue to take advantage of?
Absolutely. I mean, I think just like that last question was pointing out too, I think there's a real power in the virtual right now, and in the ability to stretch beyond just location boundaries, right? And so I think that as much as I love working physically, and I will continue to do so, I think the virtual is going to be a really important part of the practice, because it's going to allow these projects to be, span a larger distances and a lot broader communities, right? And so I think it's a lot easier to get in touch with those communities virtually right now than it is physically. And then the beauty of the projections is that anything you do virtually eventually becomes a physical part of the project, which I think is the most powerful sort of translation that's built into the work.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And just stunning and really impactful to see the evolution of the project from, like you talked about, something you can hold in your hand to something you view on the screen to all of a sudden something that surrounds you. It's pretty amazing. Yeah, there's a question in the chat. Are the works by MC students projected currently on view? They are amazing. They are amazing. So we've, I'll just answer a little bit of that and then hand it over to you, Natan. But yeah, so the classes have been working in Microsoft Teams to share their work together, these 6 2D design studio classes. And so our next step is to put the work on Instagram, so the community and anyone can follow along on Instagram. And I'll share our just in the chat. I'll put in the Instagram pages for the department. So we've just begun this process, and so you can expect to see more and more populating that virtual space. And then we're expecting many more people on campus as we look ahead into the spring. And so that's what we're thinking about for on-campus presence, so that we can be able to come together and celebrate and have, be able to engage with that larger audience. So we're exploring a variety of different ways to share the work physically on campus in the spring.
Yeah.
Yeah. And would you like to add anything?
No, that's perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and here's a question from Amanda. As an artist and anthropologist, have you noticed a higher need for community and creativity and connection during the lockdown and the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I'll double down on that by saying that I think that in tandem with that need, there's been a larger openness to it, right? Because I think people are really seeking that out, and I think that's what allowed a project like this to start flourishing, is that folks were more open to these sort of odd community collaborative encounters and just being open to what would come out of them, right? I actually think that in that sense, the pandemic has helped this project and helped other projects that are about community collaboration, because it's opened us all up to being a little bit more sensitive and a little bit more open to those kind of environments, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a real recognition of that, like, need for connection. Yeah, so this has been really great and wonderful for that. Yeah. And that was something, when we first saw your project, we really recognized how it just really seems to thrive in the virtual environment, and it's designed for this type of circumstance. It's been really wonderful.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, that's the goal. So I'm glad it got to you.
So I just want to look in the chat, make sure I didn't miss anything. So Naomi's 2D design class has been part of the project.
Hello.
Hey.
There we go. This isn't really a question for you, but just to applaud your choice of assignment for the students, giving them the parameters of the past, present, and future to work with. I thought that was a perfect way to get the students involved personally and to tell their own personal stories. And I not only had the privilege of working with you, but also I had the privilege of seeing beyond my own classroom. I got to talk to some of the students from other classes today, and it just kind of made the point that everyone had a very personal take on the assignment, and that no one could go wrong with the way that you set it up, to think about their past, their present, and their future. And I don't think you could go wrong thinking about things that have happened where you are now, but with the future, it's ambiguous for everyone. And that was a great way for them to accept the unpredictable nature of art making, and to look back on it and assess what they've done. That was a great, I think, week by week assignment of revising what they've done, and just considering the possibility for change and that kind of thing. So it's just an applaud for you of the work that you did in the classes, and I can see the results, and they're amazing results. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. That makes me so happy. I really appreciate that, Naomi, and all of the work that you and the other professors have done. It's just been like a total team effort. It's been amazing. I think that, thank you so much. I was just going to say that this past, present, and future idea that we build different patterns for past and present and future is something new that I sort of developed in talking with you all. And
that's great.
And that was because in every version of this project, I want to be able to keep opening up pathways for students and for collaborators to feel comfortable, walking in and just feeling like they can't do anything wrong, and just be able to work, wholeheartedly and with their full mind. And I think in talking with you all, with getting this project set up, it was like, okay, we need a framework for this, but it needs to be a framework that encourages that, you can do whatever you want, but there's this framework you can fall back on if you feel scared or you need, something to just hang on to because it's not quite making sense yet. And so, we got this past, future, and present. It's just been beautiful to see it happening and to be able to hear the stories from students as they work with their stamps and with their patterns. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it even works with the concept of not knowing exactly where these are going to end up. That's the future part of the assignment. So it just went hand in hand with the process of working on it. So we'll be real excited to see where they end up and to just celebrate each person's individual patterns. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
One question I have is just sort of thinking about the perspective of students who are maybe interested in doing creative work. I really appreciate, as Naomi pointed out, this idea of that you had of thinking about the past, present, and future, and just creating a framework that anyone could enter from any experience. And so, thinking about our students who, some might be in art fields or other creative fields, or, maybe just wanting to be creative, but coming from a variety of different disciplines and interests. What advice might you offer them, how to get started or how to make some connections among these different experiences that they have?
Sure. Let me try to answer this in a way that makes sense. I think the first thing that just comes from the work is, I think the most powerful thing you can do is create a tool for yourself with which you can make, whatever you're trying to make, right? And so a lot of the times that has to do with taking one aspect of whatever it is you're doing and then just using it in a way that you wouldn't normally be able to use it, right? And then using that to create creative work. So that's a very abstract idea, but that's like the base of it. Is I think there's a real power in just saying, well, I know what I know and I'm interested in this stuff I don't know, so let me take what I do know and let me just see what happens if I just start applying it and just playing with how it works in this realm that I'm not quite familiar in, and so that's why we have these sort of like very open frameworks, is so students and collaborators can bring all of themselves to the work, right? And say like, oh, I was, I'll give you one example. There's a student that we worked with in this project who came with this series of stamps that were entirely bed frames, because they were just like, when I think about every place I've lived and past, present, and future, I think about all these different bed frames that have been in my room. And it was just like, it was a totally different, I'd never seen this before as an approach, right? But it was just saying like, okay, I feel a resonance with this object. I'm going to just take this and blindly work with it. And all of a sudden they're making these beautiful patterns just out of the shape of their bed frame from childhood, And so I think to further elucidate that answer is just to say that I think as long as you put effort into it and you just try and you just keep sort of like, the beautiful thing about pattern making is it's repetition, right? And so in repeating something, even if the thing you started out with doesn't have any meaning for you, in repeating it, you start to find meanings, because that's what our brain does, right? It starts to try to like make sense of something. And so that's another way to think about how to move into more creative areas, just to try to be repetitive about it, just to try to continuously do something and then let your mind just naturally make connections. Another aspect of this that I like to talk about is I purposely work with pattern making because it's not just an art, right? It's a craft and it's a language. And I think there's people are just sort of now starting to realize how much craft making is tied to art making, and how much the process of being able to like learn techniques and be able to do these repetitive ways of creating something like we do in a craft, like tile making or ceramics or something like that, like all of those, or printmaking, all of those aspects of like learning about how to do something help you learn how to do something for yourself, like how to bring your creativity into it. And so I think it's about that. It's about being able to work with the tool that you've made yourself, being able to use that tool, find some sort of rules somewhere to use that tool just as a starting point, right? Like maybe you're really interested in tile making, and so you make something that looks like tiles you're interested. Maybe you're really interested in architecture, so you start using whatever tools you have to make imaginary buildings, and then just continuing to do it in a repetitive way that lets your brain just be free to make new connections. I think that's maybe the way I can answer that question.
Yeah, thank you. I do. I think that's really helpful. I think I noticed in looking at your work, I think maybe between some of the demonstration videos that you did for students, as well as some of the, your personal and collaborative work that you've shared, sometimes I'll see a motif that repeats, and I'm thinking about the way you've talked about building a language. So how do these stamps or these designs that you create, do they become like, how do you think of those within the context of the concept of language?
Yeah, I mean, I think about them just like that. I think I'm still building that language, right? And the whole point of living is that I'm going to keep building that language up as I go. And I think I'm really thankful to have gotten to this point where I can think about creating my own sort of like language in this way that kind of like goes back into myself. But yeah, as I make stamps just sort of as a diary of what I'm going through, right? So like I think of them as diaristic. I try to just do sketches for stamps or make actual physical hand stamps whenever I'm inspired by something going on in my life, right? And then the actual creation of the language is through using that, right? It's through making meaning through that moment. And so something as simple as just sort of translating a photo I took on my phone onto a piece of rubber and then carving it, that's just making the stamp. Actually putting the meaning into it and turning it into the languages by using it and by seeing sort of like where my mind goes and what memories come up and what emotions come up, right? And then once I've done that enough times, then I feel like, oh yeah, this stamp means this, or this stamp is this emotion. And then I can start to mix and match and really go back. And then the beautiful thing is you start to build this archive of these memories and these emotions, right? And then when you put them in new connections with each other, right? You use a stamp next to another stamp, you've never done that before, like that connection between those two stamps, it starts to create even a new memory or a new emotion. So you get to grow this archive in this language.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions. So Kyle says, what has inspired you the most in your anthropological career regarding art?
Great question. And this is going to sound like a weird answer, but it's the real answer. So I'm going to go with it. The thing that inspired me the most was starting my degree in anthropology. One of the first books we read was Argonauts of the Western Pacific, which is sort of this classic book by Bronislaw Malinowski about, it's a classic piece of what is now probably called armchair anthropology, which is like, a sort of older white man going into a at that point, what they would call a primitive community and trying to glean ideas of culture, right? And so that was kind of like, it's always been taught as this like basic founding text for anthropology. And then the next book we read was his diaries that he wrote, but that didn't get published until after his death. And the diaries make it pretty clear that he made up most of that first book that became a tome for anthropology. And so what really opened up my eyes is like, oh, anthropology could be an artistic practice, was when I realized that it was already a fictional practice in some of the main readings for it. And so I didn't think of that as a weakness or a negative. I thought that was really amazing, because what it meant was that even through fictionalizing, even through creating something from whole cloth, we were able to get to ideas that had deep resonance and that were able to be used by each of us to think about how we live and how we communicate and how we work in a culture. And so I thought that was a huge strength. And I just applied that to the idea, well, then art can be more like anthropology, because anthropology is already a lot like art. We're just not talking about it.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the question, Kyle, as well. And Professor Sprain asks, is there a website where we can see more of the projected art? And so I would say definitely Natan's website.
Absolutely.
And we will, like I said, for the our patterns Montgomery will be continuing to post, as well as updates, for when we have something on campus. And would you like to add anything more to that, Natan, as far as sources you'd like to share?
No, I mean, my website has mostly everything. And so if you go to the website and you look at the projects, each project links back out to all the videos associated with it, all the Instagram pages, all of that. So it should be there.
Yeah, that's a really good hub. And then you can see the different community projects that you've done. Yeah. And so we have we'll say one last question within our time here. So Daniela says, do the hidden meanings represent language in artwork? And can we find meaning to the artist patterns in the quilts? So, yeah.
Yeah, great. I think it comes down to translation, right? And that's the beauty of it, is absolutely yes, but that meaning is going to be your own and not necessarily the meaning that the artist intended. And I think that's a good thing, right? And so the project is about allowing us as a community of collaborators to make work that has meaning to us, and then displaying it in a way that creates even further meaning to those folks that interact with it and view it. So definitely yes, but the meanings will be translated and will change for whoever sees it.
Wow, so it sounds like there's really a lot of openness there, like openness in the creative process, but then openness in what you bring to it and how you interpret it.
Absolutely. I think that's a foundational part of allowing folks to feel like really free in their creativity is really respecting the way everybody makes meaning. And so openness is a big key aspect of it.
Wonderful. Well, Natan, thank you so much for your presentation and for this wonderful conversation and answering these questions. It's been really amazing, and it's been fantastic to see the student work that's coming out of your project, and I can't wait to be able to share more of it with the community.
Thank you so much, and I've been blessed and honored by getting to do this with you all, and I thank you all who asked questions today because they were just so wonderful, and yeah, I'm just so thankful.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Yes, I see lots of applause. Thanks everyone for coming today, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.